In the UK, we keep hearing vaccines. In America, we hear vaccines, and it feels like we're being told that this is the only way we can return to normalcy, the only way we can go back to work. And I had a guest yesterday, and we streamed to 1 million people watch this. It was the largest live stream of a conversation in human history. And he said, Brian, there's something called a problem reaction solution. You have a problem, there's a public reaction, and then there's a solution. And it feels like we're kind of all being herded toward this vaccine, and now it's being rushed. And I'm just wondering, what is your take on all of this? Do you think it's something we should proceed with caution? Do you think there are pros and cons of a potential vaccine? Or just curious what your take is on kind of the entire situation.
Well, I agree with first of all, let me apologize for my voice, Brian, which should improve as we talk. I had a very, very strong voice till I was 42 years old, and then I got a disease called spasmodic dystonia, which is a neurological disease, and it makes my voice break up like this. But usually after I talk for a while, it gets better, I hope. But my kind of impression about what's happening now is colored by my work on vaccines over the past 15 years. And I want to start, I'm an attorney. I'm primarily an environmental attorney. I sue polluters. I run one of the biggest and one of the founders of the biggest water protection group in the world, which is the Waterkeeper. We have 350 waterkeepers on waterways, operating patrol boats on waterways in 46 countries. We have one in London on the Thames River Keeper, and all over the world, and they patrol those waterways, they track down polluters, and we litigate against them. And that's kind of how my pathway was into this issue, which I got dragged kicking and screaming into the vaccine issue. But, and I got brought in because of the mercury issue. In the early 2000s, there was a lot of mercury in American vaccines. I was suing coal burning power plants all over North America and Canada and the United States for discharging mercury into the air, which was then getting into the water, and it was contaminating the fish. In 2003, FDA released a report that showed that every freshwater fish in America had dangerous levels of mercury in its flesh. So we were litigating, many of the waterkeepers were litigating against coal burning power plants and cement kilns in many of our states and several of the provinces of Canada. And I was going around managing the litigation and also working on legislation and giving speeches. And almost everywhere I spoke, there would be women in the audience who would come up to me afterwards, and it turned out they were the mothers of intellectually disabled kids, and they believed that their children had been injured from mercury in vaccines. And they would say to me, kind of in a mildly scolding but very respectful way, if you're genuinely interested in mercury contamination and children, exposures to children, you need to look at the mercury in vaccines. It's not something that I wanted to do. Eventually, one of these mothers came to my house, a psychologist named Sarah Bridges. Her son had been injured by vaccines, by mercury in vaccines. He'd actually, the vaccine court, the federal vaccine court had recognized that he got autism from vaccines. His name is Porter Bridges. And they gave him a $20 million lifetime reward, including paying for all of his schooling and autism treatment and training and this kind of thing. She didn't want the same thing to happen to other children. She came to me, she had a pile of scientific studies that was 18 inches deep. She put them on my front porch in Cape Cod in the summer of 2005. And she told me, I'm not leaving here till you read these. I'm very comfortable reading science. I've brought over 500 successful legal actions during my career, almost all on environmental issues. Almost all of them included some kind of scientific controversy. So I need to be able to read science, to understand it and dissect it, and to read it critically. And I started reading these studies, and before I was 6 inches down in that pile, I was already astonished at the huge delta between what the public health agencies were telling us about mercury in vaccines and vaccine safety in general, and what the actual published peer-reviewed science was saying about that issue. And I began doing what I always would do in those cases when I didn't understand something. I started calling the regulators and the people who made those decisions. And because my family has been on the spear tip of the movement for rights and treatments for people with intellectual disabilities for generations, for 80 years, I had access to all of those people, and they would pick up the phone. And I talked to Anthony Fauci, and I talked to Francis Collins, and I talked to Mary McCormick, who was the head of the Institute of Medicine, and Kathleen Stratton, and Paul Offit, and all the people who were kind of at the forefront of getting us all to use vaccines. And I realized very early on during those conversations that they were not, number one, were not conversant with the science, and number two, in many cases, were simply lying about it. And that took me down this rabbit hole where 15 years later, this is one of the central preoccupations of my life and my career. I'm not anti-vaccine. I've been fighting. I've been fighting against mercury in fish, to get the mercury out of the fish for 37 years. Nobody calls me anti-fish. If somebody comes up with a vaccine for COVID or anything else that actually does what it promises to do, which is to avert disease without side effects, without significant side effects, then I would totally support that. The problem is that we don't know of any vaccine that actually does that. And the reason we don't know is because vaccines are not safety tested. So of the 72 vaccines that are now mandated for American children in our country, not a single one has ever been tested against an inert placebo. And that means that if you don't test it in placebo tests, like every other medicine, it's not science, it's marketing. And the reason the vaccines don't have to be safety tested is an artifact of CDC's legacy as the Public Health Service, which was its predecessor agency. The Public Health Service was a quasi-military agency, which is why people at CDC have military ranks like Surgeon General, et cetera. And the vaccine program was initially conceived and launched as a national security defense against biological attacks on our country. So the Pentagon and the Public Health Service wanted to make sure, the regulators wanted to make sure that if the Russians attacked us with anthrax or some other biological agent, that we would be able to quickly fabricate a vaccine and develop it and then deploy it to 200 million Americans without regulatory impediments. So they said, if we call it a medicine, you have to safety test medicines. And that usually takes about 5 years because there are many injuries that occur, cancers and autoimmune diseases that occur when you start messing with the immune system that have long diagnostic horizons that you won't see for many, many years. So normally medicines are tested for 5 years in double-blind placebo tests. They said, we don't want to do that. But if we call it a medicine, we have to do that. So we will call it something else. We're going to call it a biologic, and then we're going to exempt biologics from safety testing.